Hello. Tonight you find yourself standing at the quiet edge of a forgotten world, where two ancient rivers drift slowly through the land like long, unbroken thoughts. And something about their calm movement feels strangely familiar, as if you have stepped into a memory that has been waiting patiently for you to return. You begin to notice how the land stretches gently between these rivers, wide and still, where the water reflects a soft golden light from the setting sun. And everything seems to move just a little more slowly here, as though time itself has decided to relax for the evening, much like someone finally closing their laptop after pretending to work. The air is warm, but not heavy, carrying the faint scent of wet soil and distant reeds. Seasons here follow a steady and predictable rhythm, where floods arrive not as disasters, but as expected guests, returning each year with reliability of someone who never forgets your birthday, unlike most group chats. So before you get completely comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what we're creating here. And if you do. So before you get completely comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what we're creating here. And if you do, perhaps share it with someone who might also appreciate a quieter story before sleep, and feel free to leave a comment with your location and time. Now, slowly dim the lights. Perhaps turn on a fan, letting the steady hum of the air fill the room. And in that gentle rhythm, we quietly step into tonight's journey together. As the rivers continue to whisper in the darkness, and somewhere within their endless flow, something unseen begins to take shape, almost imperceptibly. You walk along the soft riverbank, where the earth yields gently beneath your feet, and small clusters of homes made from mud and reeds rise quietly from the ground. Their shapes simple and rounded, as if they belong here as naturally as the grasses, like very determined sandcastles that somehow survived the tide. People move through this space with an unhurried calm, their gestures steady and unforced, and you notice how their lives unfold without the sharp interruptions of urgency, which feels almost unfamiliar, especially when compared to the quiet chaos of modern schedules that somehow manage to feel busy even when nothing is happening. In the early morning light, you see them tending to fields that stretch outward in soft, earthy tones, planting seeds into soil enriched by the river's gentle flooding. And each motion seems intentional yet relaxed, as though time itself has slowed just enough to allow every action to feel complete. As the day drifts forward, work and rest blend together without clear boundaries, and no one appears to rush from one task to the next, because there is no sense of falling behind, which feels surprisingly comforting, especially when you remember how often modern life feels like a race with no visible finish line. You begin to understand that life here is shaped by repetition, but not the kind that feels dull or exhausting. Rather a gentle cycle that offers quiet reassurance, like hearing the same melody each evening, or returning to a familiar story simply because you already know it will unfold softly and come to rest in a peaceful ending. As evening approaches, small fires begin to glow near the homes, their light flickering gently against the deepening darkness, and people gather quietly around them, not from urgency, but with a shared sense of purpose, preparing for rituals that feel as natural as breathing, and far less confusing than assembling something without instructions or missing pieces. They place simple offerings near the fire, grains, water, and carefully chosen seeds, arranging them with quiet attention. And you sense these gestures are not shaped by fear, but by a calm belief that care itself holds meaning. Much like tending to a plant and hoping it quietly forgives the moments when you forget it exists. In this land, there are no borders drawn across maps, no empires named or imagined, only a shared understanding of place and time, where people live within rhythms they do not fully control, and somehow that gentle uncertainty feels far less stressful than trying to remember yet another password you once promised yourself to write down. You begin to notice certain individuals who carry a quieter kind of presence, not louder or more commanding, but deeply grounded, as though they are listening to something beneath the surface of ordinary life. And these are the ones who gently guide the rituals, shaping the connection between people and the unseen forces they trust with calm and steady intention. In what we now call ancient Mesopotamia, early agricultural societies practiced rituals tied closely to seasonal cycles, believing that their harvest depended on maintaining harmony with divine forces. And you sense that this quiet relationship between effort and faith feels surprisingly familiar, much like hoping your internet remains stable during an important moment. The rivers continue their steady flow beside you, unchanged and patient, shaping the land and the lives around them without effort, like a quiet rhythm that no one questions. And you begin to realize that everything here moves in balance, without urgency, without resistance, as though the world itself has found a way to breathe. As night settles fully, the sounds of the land soften into a gentle, steady rhythm, where insects hum quietly in the distance, and the river brushes its banks with a calm whisper. The fire dims into glowing embers, and you rest within that stillness, feeling as though nothing is missing and nothing is asking more from you. The quiet deepens in a way that feels almost tangible, as if the air itself has slowed to match the rhythm of the earth. And you notice how every small sound carries a sense of balance. It is the kind of calm that does not need explanation, much like finally finding a comfortable position after shifting far too many times. And within that peaceful repetition, something else begins to form, something subtle and nearly invisible, like a quiet pattern moving beneath still water. No one here would name it or try to define it, yet you begin to sense it gently, as though the land itself is beginning to think. But in that peaceful rhythm, power is quietly beginning to take shape. You remain beside the slow-moving rivers, and as your eyes settle into this quiet world, you begin to notice something subtle beneath the calm surface, a gentle structure shaping how people live, decide, and gather, not through force or command, but through a shared understanding that feels almost invisible, like an agreement everyone remembers without ever writing it down. In the center of each small settlement, there is often a figure who speaks softly, yet is listened to with care, someone older perhaps, or simply more observant. And you sense that this person does not rule as modern leaders might, but instead guides gently, like someone reading the weather by feeling the air instead of checking a forecast. Nearby, another presence becomes clear, quieter still, someone who tends to the rituals, preparing offerings, arranging sacred spaces, and remembering the sequences others trust but may not fully understand. And you realize this role carries a different kind of authority, one that depends less on strength and more on careful attention and quiet continuity. You begin to understand that power here is not held through control, but through connection, especially the ability to communicate with forces that cannot be seen. And this idea feels both distant and familiar, like speaking to a plant and quietly hoping it appreciates the effort, even if it never offers any visible sign of response. Rituals shape the rhythm of this society in ways that feel both simple and deeply meaningful, and you notice how certain moments are marked not by dates, but by shared actions, repeated carefully, as though each step matters. Much like following a recipe that someone insists should never be changed, even if no one remembers exactly why. When the sky remains dry for too long, people gather in quiet circles, to perform rituals that gently invite the return of rain, offering grains and soft-spoken words to unseen forces. And the act feels less like a demand and more like a calm conversation, which feels comforting, especially when compared to modern efforts to predict weather that often remain uncertain. At the beginning of each planting season, another ritual unfolds with careful attention, where seeds are not simply scattered into the soil, but placed with intention, as if being introduced rather than buried, and you sense a quiet respect in this gesture, like softly knocking before entering a space that does not fully belong to you. Even in moments of loss, rituals create a calm and steady structure, as you observe gentle ceremonies marking the passing of a life where fire, earth, and memory meet in quiet balance. Nothing feels rushed or chaotic. Instead, there is a soft, patient space that allows grief to unfold naturally, moving slowly and gently without needing to be contained or forced. These ceremonies unfold with a careful rhythm, where each gesture feels considered and meaningful. And you sense that the purpose is not to control sorrow, but to give it space, allowing it to settle naturally, much like sitting quietly with a feeling instead of trying to resolve it too quickly. In many early societies, including those of ancient Sumer, the individuals who guided these rituals were often seen as the most important figures, not because they led armies, but because they understood how to maintain a delicate balance between people and unseen forces, shaping the world quietly through their awareness. You notice how this shared belief creates a deep sense of unity, where people trust both the rituals and those who preserve them, and this trust becomes a quiet foundation for stability. Much like relying on a familiar routine to bring a sense of calm and reassurance at the end of each day, there is a quiet strength in this system that does not depend on force or fear, but instead grows slowly from repetition and shared meaning. And you begin to sense how this kind of power feels less visible, yet deeply rooted, like the calm confidence of someone who never needs to raise their voice in order to be clearly understood. And yet, beneath this calm and balanced structure, there is also a certain fragility, because everything depends on natural cycles continuing, as expected, and on the belief that rituals still hold their meaning, which feels a little like trusting that something important will work properly, without ever pausing to check if it truly still does. You begin to sense that if the floods were to fail, arrive too strongly, or not come at all, this delicate balance could slowly begin to shift, and questions might quietly emerge, not with urgency or alarm, but in the same gentle way that doubt appears when something familiar changes in a way you had never expected before. Beyond these settlements, you start to notice that other communities exist along distant stretches of the rivers, each with their own variations of rituals and practices, and they exchange goods and ideas in a calm and steady way, like neighbors sharing recipes that feel similar in spirit, yet never exactly the same when brought together. These connections slowly form a wider network of understanding, where shared elements in ritual allow different groups to relate to one another even without a common language. And this quiet familiarity feels surprisingly natural, like recognizing a melody played on a different instrument and still knowing exactly what it is, even without hearing it before. For now, everything remains steady, held together by belief, repetition, and a quiet sense of trust, and you find yourself settling into this rhythm, where nothing feels urgent and nothing demands immediate change, and the world seems content to continue just as it is, without any need to become something different or more complicated than necessary. However, as you continue to listen to the slow whisper of the rivers, you begin to sense that beyond this calm horizon, something else is moving, shaped by different pressures and different needs. and its rhythm feels just slightly stronger, as though it carries with it a quiet intention that has not yet fully revealed itself. However, somewhere far beyond these quiet waters, other currents are beginning to gather strength, moving steadily and patiently through distant lands. And though they remain unseen for now, you sense that their presence will eventually reach even this calm and carefully balanced world, altering it in ways that will unfold slowly over time. You slowly turn your attention away from the gentle rivers, and as your gaze drifts toward distant horizons, the landscape begins to change in quiet but noticeable ways, where the air feels drier, the ground more rigid, and the rhythm of life no longer flows as softly, as if the world itself has become slightly more alert. Here, the land stretches wider and harsher, with fewer signs of water and less forgiving soil, and you notice how the colors shift toward muted browns and pale golds, like a painting left too long beneath the sun, which feels a bit like leaving a peaceful park and walking quietly into a very serious and silent meeting. The wind moves differently in this place, carrying dust instead of moisture, and the silence feels sharper and less comforting, as though each sound stands out more clearly, and you begin to sense that survival here requires a different kind of attention, one that is more focused, deliberate, and far less forgiving than before. Communities still exist here, but they are arranged more tightly together. Their structures close as if seeking strength through proximity, and you notice how people move with greater purpose, their actions more deliberate and measured, which feels similar to how people begin to walk faster when they quietly realize they are already running late. Resources are not as easily found, and you begin to sense how each decision carries a little more weight, as though nothing can be taken for granted, and even small tasks require planning, which creates a quiet tension that sits beneath daily life, without ever needing to be openly acknowledged or discussed. And within this more demanding environment, you begin to notice how people adapt not through sudden change, but through careful organization, shaping their routines and structures with intention, as if every movement matters, and this quiet discipline begins to form the foundation of something new, something that is slowly preparing to extend beyond this land. The population here has grown steadily over time, and with that growth comes a quiet pressure on the land, as resources become more limited, and you sense how this scarcity encourages people to think differently, not just about survival, but about organization and long-term stability. You begin to see how leadership takes on a slightly different form, becoming more structured, more defined, and while rituals are still present, they now carry an additional layer of intention, not only connecting people to unseen forces, but also guiding how they work together. Rituals here are repeated with greater precision, almost like a carefully practiced routine, and you notice how they bring people into alignment, creating a shared sense of purpose that feels both calming and disciplined, like everyone silently agreeing to follow the same instructions without needing reminders. In this environment, rituals are no longer only about asking for rain or honoring cycles, but also about reinforcing unity, ensuring that each person understands their role within the group, which feels surprisingly similar to how teams today rely on structure. Though perhaps with fewer spreadsheets involved, you begin to understand that this shift is subtle but important, because belief is no longer just a personal or communal comfort. It becomes a tool that shapes behavior, guiding how people act together, and helping them navigate the challenges of a less forgiving landscape. Historically, this gradual transformation can be seen in the rise of early city-states, where organization became essential for managing resources and people, and among them, the Akkadian Empire under Sargon stands as one of the earliest examples of a more connected political structure forming across regions, shaped not by sudden events, but by the steady accumulation of practical needs. These early city-states developed systems of coordination that allowed them to manage trade, labor, and communication more effectively. And you begin to sense how this growing complexity required leadership that could extend beyond individual communities, creating connections that linked distant places together, much like building a network step by step without ever seeing its full shape at once. Sargon of Akkad, often remembered as one of the first rulers to unify multiple cities under a single authority, did not emerge from chaos alone, but from these quiet shifts in structure and necessity, where leadership and coordination became increasingly important, allowing one system to gradually extend its influence across lands that were once separate and self-contained. You begin to sense that this quiet rise is not shaped by aggression, but by a deeper need for balance, as communities look for ways to manage limited resources, protect what remains stable, and ensure continuity, which feels less like expansion for its own sake, and more like trying to keep everything from slowly drifting out of alignment over time. The people here do not see themselves as conquerors, but as participants in a changing world, where adaptation becomes necessary, and you notice how their decisions are shaped not only by ambition, but by the quiet pressures of environment and survival, which guide them gently, like adjusting your steps without fully realizing why. There is a calm determination in their actions, a steady sense that something must be done, even if no one fully explains it in clear terms. And you find this quiet resolve both grounding and familiar, like making practical choices after slowly understanding that the situation will not simply improve on its own. As their systems grow more organized, their reach begins to extend outward in gradual ways, not through sudden movement, but through careful steps, and you start to sense how their awareness of neighboring lands becomes more focused, especially toward places where resources appear more stable and life seems easier to sustain. Somewhere beyond the dry and distant horizon, they begin to hear of lands where rivers move more freely, where soil feels softer, and where life follows a gentler and more predictable rhythm. And these quiet descriptions settle into their thoughts, like an idea that slowly takes shape without needing to be spoken aloud. And in that quiet moment of awareness, where need gently meets opportunity, something begins to shift again, not abruptly, but with the same steady pace that defines everything here. As attention gradually turns toward a place where water and life move together in calm and lasting harmony. And then, their gaze begins to rest upon a land shaped by rivers, where abundance flows softly, waiting to be noticed. You follow that quiet shift in attention, and as your awareness returns to the rivered land, you begin to see it differently, not only as a peaceful place of gentle cycles, but as a space shaped by advantages so natural that no one feels the need to name them, like having excellent Wi-Fi and never once thinking about routers. The soil beneath your feet feels soft, dark, and quietly alive, enriched by layers of silt, carried patiently by seasonal floods, and you notice how this land seems to renew itself without effort, offering nourishment again and again, like a kitchen that somehow restocks overnight, which would be surprisingly convenient in modern life. And as you stand there a little longer, you begin to sense how these quiet advantages shape everything around you, not in obvious ways, but through a steady and dependable rhythm, where growth feels natural and time moves gently forward, allowing life to continue without interruption, like a system that simply works without ever needing to explain itself. Water flows steadily here, not in sudden bursts, but in calm, reliable currents that can be followed, measured, and trusted. And you begin to understand how this consistency shapes everything, allowing people to plan, to settle, and to grow without the constant uncertainty that defines harsher and less forgiving environments. The rivers themselves form natural pathways, long and winding routes that connect distant communities. And you imagine how easily a small boat could travel along these waters, carrying goods, ideas, and stories, much like a slow-moving delivery system that never requires tracking updates or sudden changes in direction. Along the riverbanks, the land opens into gentle plains that stretch outward with quiet ease, making travel by foot or simple carts just as possible. And you sense how this accessibility creates connections, allowing movement without resistance, which feels surprisingly similar to choosing a route that works exactly as expected. There are no steep mountains or dense barriers protecting this region, no natural walls separating one place from another. And while this openness allows for easy connection, it also means that nothing here is truly hidden, which feels both comforting and slightly inconvenient, depending on how you prefer to experience the world around you. You begin to realize that this land does not resist being approached, and its quiet generosity makes it inviting in ways that feel almost effortless, like a place that welcomes visitors without needing to announce it, though perhaps without any sign, gently reminding them to remove their shoes before stepping inside. In many early civilizations, it was precisely these river-based environments that supported the growth of complex societies, because water allowed not only agriculture, but also transportation and coordination, creating conditions where communities could expand while still remaining connected to one another in quiet and practical ways. This combination of fertile soil, steady water, and open pathways forms something more than a simple landscape. It becomes a system, one that quietly supports growth, exchange, and stability. And you begin to see how such a place naturally draws attention from those who are searching for balance. From afar, this region would not appear dramatic or imposing, but rather calm, steady, and reliable. And it is exactly this consistency that makes it valuable, like choosing a dependable tool over something more complicated that promises much, but rarely delivers when it is actually needed most. You imagine how those from harsher lands might begin to view this place, not with sudden urgency, but with a growing awareness that something here aligns with their needs. And this recognition does not feel like desire in the usual sense, but more like a quiet and steady understanding. The rivers continue to guide your thoughts, their steady movement suggesting a kind of silent invitation, not spoken aloud, but present all the same, and you sense how their paths naturally lead others toward this land, without resistance or confusion, like following directions that never require a second guess. There are no defenses here designed to keep others away, no structured barriers or organized systems of protection, because there has never truly been a need for them, and this absence feels peaceful, though it also leaves the land open in ways that no one has fully considered yet, like a door left unlocked simply because it always has been. You begin to understand that the value of this place is not accidental, but inherent, shaped slowly by geography and time. And while the people who live here experience it as something ordinary, others may come to see it as rare, something worth moving toward, even if they cannot fully explain the quiet reasons guiding that sense of recognition. This quiet convergence of resources, accessibility, and stability turns the land into a natural point of gathering, where different paths meet without conflict or resistance. And you begin to sense how such places often become centers of attention over time, even when no one has planned for them to take on that quiet and lasting role. As your thoughts settle, You notice that nothing changes suddenly here, and even this growing awareness unfolds slowly and gently. The land itself remains calm, untouched by urgency, continuing its steady rhythm without interruption. Everything persists in quiet balance, without pressure to transform or become anything different, as if time itself prefers to move forward without drawing attention to itself. You feel the stillness deepen, as though the land itself is quietly aware of its own balance, holding everything gently in place without effort. And this calm presence makes it easy to forget that anything could ever change, even though change is always moving softly beneath the surface, waiting patiently without urgency or any need to be noticed too soon. And in that stillness, where everything feels balanced and complete, you begin to sense that change will not arrive all at once, but will unfold gradually, carried by the same quiet currents that shape everything else, unnoticed at first, and then slowly understood, like a thought forming gently over time, without ever needing to be forced into clarity. But within that quiet certainty, something begins to gather just beyond the edges of awareness, not as a disruption, but as a gentle continuation. And you begin to sense that the same qualities that make this land feel so calm and inviting will, in time, quietly draw others toward it without urgency, yet with a steady and almost inevitable pull. You remain within the calm of the rivered land, and at first nothing appears to change as the same gentle rhythms continue. The same fields are tended with care, and the same rituals unfold in quiet repetition. Yet beneath this familiar pattern, something new begins to move softly, not with disruption, but with the subtle presence of an idea slowly settling into everyday life. At the edges of the settlement, you begin to notice small groups arriving, not in large or overwhelming numbers, but gradually, carrying goods arranged with quiet care. And their presence feels calm and unthreatening, like visitors who have come not to take anything away, but to exchange something of value, which feels reassuring in its simplicity and ease. They bring grains different from those grown locally, tools shaped with unfamiliar precision, and small crafted objects used in rituals, each item carrying with it traces of another place. And you sense how these exchanges are not only practical in nature, but also quietly meaningful, like sharing pieces of a story without ever needing to explain it fully. In return, the people of the river offer their own harvests, their own materials, and their own ways of doing things. And this mutual exchange creates a gentle bridge between communities, where differences are not erased or ignored, but shared and appreciated, much like exchanging recipes that remain distinct while still offering something new to taste and understand. Over time, these interactions become more frequent, and you notice how familiarity begins to grow. Where once there was distance, now there is recognition, and this slow transformation feels natural, like gradually learning someone's habits without ever needing a formal introduction, or a clear moment when everything suddenly becomes understood. With each visit, small ideas begin to travel alongside goods, and you start to notice subtle changes in how certain rituals are performed, as new gestures are introduced and older ones are gently adapted, not replaced entirely, but expanded in quiet ways, like updating a tradition while still keeping its original meaning intact. Some of the newcomers remain longer than they first intended, gradually choosing to settle near the river, where they build homes that reflect both their origins and their new surroundings. And you begin to sense how this blending creates something that feels neither entirely new nor entirely familiar, but gently balanced in between, like a space that quietly learns how to belong. You observe how these settlers begin to take part in local rituals, first as respectful guests who follow along carefully, then as active contributors who understand more with time, and eventually as part of the shared rhythm itself. And this gradual inclusion feels seamless, like stepping into a conversation that has been unfolding quietly long before you arrived. Over time, certain rituals begin to take on slightly different forms, becoming more structured and gently coordinated. And you notice how this subtle shift influences not only spiritual practices, but also the way people begin to organize their daily routines and shared responsibilities, creating a rhythm that feels more connected, though still calm and familiar. Historically, many early empires expanded in this way, not through sudden conquest or visible force, but through steady networks of trade and alliances, where influence grew quietly over time, and you begin to sense how this process feels less like a takeover and more like a gradual and natural alignment. You begin to notice agreements forming between smaller communities and these larger, more organized groups, not written in formal language, but understood through repeated actions and shared benefit, which feels surprisingly familiar, like informal understandings that slowly become essential parts of daily life. These quiet alliances begin to offer a growing sense of security and connection, as people gradually rely on wider networks for support and exchange. And while this feels comforting and steady in many ways, it also introduces a subtle layer of dependency, though no one seems to question it just yet, like trusting a system that has always worked without asking how it functions. As more settlers arrive over time, new spaces slowly begin to appear within the community, places carefully shaped for rituals that blend elements from different traditions. And these spaces feel slightly different in tone, more deliberate in their design, as though they are meant to gather people with greater intention, creating moments that feel both familiar and quietly new. You begin to notice how these newly formed ritual spaces gently shift attention, drawing larger groups together at certain moments, creating shared experiences that feel more coordinated than before, like gatherings that follow a quiet and familiar rhythm without needing to be formally announced, as if everyone somehow knows when to arrive without checking anything at all. The changes remain soft and nearly unnoticeable unless you are watching with careful attention, and daily life continues much as it always has. Yet beneath that steady familiarity, the underlying structure begins to feel more connected, more quietly aligned with something that stretches beyond the immediate surroundings, like a pattern forming without ever being clearly outlined. There is no sense of urgency or conflict within this gradual transformation, only a slow and steady merging of ideas, practices, and relationships. And you begin to understand how influence can move like water, shaping everything it touches gently, without pressure, without resistance, and without ever needing to force its way forward or announce its presence. As you continue to observe this quiet process of integration, you begin to sense that something larger is forming, not through sudden or dramatic changes, but through the accumulation of many small and steady shifts that gradually reshape how everything connects, like a structure emerging slowly without anyone needing to design it all at once. And over time, these gradual shifts begin to settle into something more clearly recognizable, where what once felt separate now feels gently unified, and you come to realize that this transformation has been unfolding all along, quietly and patiently, without ever needing to announce itself, like a pattern that only becomes visible once you stop trying to look for it directly. And then, one day, without any clear signal or ceremony to mark the moment, everything begins to feel unmistakably different, not because something has suddenly changed, but because all the small, steady changes have finally come together into something That can no longer be overlooked, like realizing a quiet thought has been guiding you for some time. You wake into a morning that feels almost identical to those before it, where light stretches softly across the river, and the air carries the same gentle stillness. Yet something beneath the surface has shifted, not loudly or dramatically, but with the calm certainty of a decision already made, like waking up knowing something has changed without remembering exactly when it happened. There is no single moment that announces this change. No sound of conflict or disruption. Only a subtle adjustment in how people move, speak, and gather, as if an invisible line has been quietly redrawn, though no one seems eager to point it out, like a room rearranged overnight where everything still works, but nothing is exactly where you remember. At the center of the settlement, you begin to notice new figures taking part in decisions that were once guided by familiar voices. And this transition feels smooth, almost rehearsed, like a conversation where one person simply continues, speaking after another has gently and quietly stepped away without drawing attention to the shift itself. The individuals who once held quiet authority are still present within the community, but their roles begin to soften, blending into a wider structure rather than standing apart from it. And you sense that this is not a disappearance, but a gradual folding into something larger, like a voice joining a chorus rather than remaining alone. No battles mark this moment. No visible resistance interrupts the steady flow of daily life. And the fields are still tended, the rivers still followed, which makes the change feel almost abstract, like updating a system that continues running without ever needing to pause or restart, quietly adjusting itself without any interruption to its familiar rhythm. You begin to understand that control here is not taken in any visible way, but gently assumed as new patterns settle into place and older ones adapt around them. And this quiet transition feels less like an ending and more like a continuation, simply moving forward in a slightly different direction without losing what came before. In time, the land itself begins to be described in new ways, not only through its rivers and soil, but through its place within a broader structure. And you sense how names, like water, can shift gently without losing their essence, like calling something familiar by a new term that slowly becomes just as natural. Historically, this kind of transformation can be seen in the rise of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon, who brought together multiple regions into a unified system, not always through direct conflict, but through coordination and integration that unfolded gradually, showing how power can expand quietly, shaped by connection rather than disruption. You notice how this broader connection introduces a new layer of organization, where decisions are influenced by considerations that extend beyond the immediate community. And this expansion feels both stabilizing and slightly distant, like following guidance that makes sense, even if it comes from somewhere beyond your immediate view. The rituals, too, begin to change in subtle ways. As familiar practices are maintained but gently adjusted, their meanings expanding to align with a wider understanding. And you sense how this reinterpretation allows continuity without complete replacement, like adding new meaning to a story without changing its original form. Some gestures become more formal, more structured, as though they are now part of a larger sequence that extends beyond the local setting. And this shift feels gradual, like adding steps to a routine that was once instinctive, making it feel slightly more deliberate, yet still comfortably recognizable in its rhythm. The people continue their daily lives, planting, gathering, and resting as they always have. And for many, the changes are not immediately noticeable, because the rhythm of existence remains steady, even as its structure evolves quietly in the background, like a melody that remains the same, even as new harmonies are added. You begin to see how the absence of disruption allows the transition to feel natural, almost inevitable. And this quiet acceptance reflects a world where adaptation happens gradually, without the need for sudden resistance or dramatic shifts, like adjusting to a new habit without ever marking the moment when it began. The older leaders, those who once guided rituals and decisions, are still respected and present, but their influence becomes part of a broader system, where their knowledge is integrated rather than replaced. And this blending feels both respectful and practical, like preserving something valuable by allowing it to evolve. There is a sense that nothing has been lost entirely, only rearranged within a wider structure, and this continuity offers a quiet comfort, like moving objects within a familiar room without removing them, even if it takes a moment to remember where everything now rests in its new arrangement. And yet everything still feels present, just gently repositioned within a slightly expanded and evolving sense of place. As the days pass, the new structure becomes less noticeable, simply because it becomes normal. And you begin to understand how easily change can settle into routine when it arrives without urgency or conflict, quietly becoming part of life without ever asking for attention or acknowledgement, like a habit that forms so naturally you cannot recall when it first began. In this gentle transformation, where land, leadership, and ritual all shift into new forms, you begin to sense that the most meaningful changes are not always visible, but instead unfold slowly within people themselves, quietly shaping how they understand their place in a world that continues to move forward without pause. Like a thought that settles gently without ever needing to be fully explained. You begin to notice how this internal shift changes perception more than structure, where people start to see their world through a slightly wider lens, even if they cannot fully explain it, like realizing you have learned something new without remembering the exact moment the understanding first arrived. And somehow everything feels just a little clearer than it did before. But the deepest change does not lie in power, or land, or names, but in the quiet ways people begin to see their world differently, where familiar things carry new meaning, and the flow of life continues, steady and calm, even as everything within it slowly becomes something more connected, like pieces that were always meant to fit gently together. You move gently through the same fields you have come to recognize, and at first, everything appears unchanged. The rivers still flow with quiet patience, and the soil still welcomes the seeds. Yet something subtle has shifted beneath the surface, like a familiar song played in a slightly different key that you notice, but cannot quite name. The people continue their daily routines, rising with the morning light, tending carefully to crops, and gathering together as evening settles, and their movements remain calm and steady, yet within their conversations, you begin to notice small differences, tiny variations in tone and phrasing that quietly reshape how meaning is shared between them over time. Language begins to shift almost imperceptibly, with new sounds blending softly into familiar patterns, and certain expressions slowly taking on slightly altered meanings. And this quiet evolution feels natural, like adjusting to a new accent without ever deciding to learn it, simply understanding more with each passing day. Some words from distant places become part of daily speech, not replacing older ones entirely, but weaving into them gently, creating something layered and flexible, which feels a bit like adding new apps to your phone while still keeping the old ones you rarely open, but somehow never delete. Rituals, too, begin to carry new elements as gestures and sequences are gradually expanded, and you notice how familiar ceremonies now include additional steps, subtle changes that reflect broader influences while still honoring their original purpose. like adding new lines to a story that has been told many times before. At first, these changes seem small, almost decorative, additions that do not alter the essence of the ritual, but over time, they begin to shape how people experience these moments, adding layers of meaning that feel both familiar and quietly unfamiliar. At the same time, some individuals choose to leave, moving toward regions where the rhythms remain closer to what they once knew, and their departures happen quietly, without conflict or resistance, like stepping away from a conversation that has slowly changed without anyone clearly noticing when it began. Others remain, adapting gradually to the evolving structure, finding comfort in the continuity that still exists beneath the changes. And you sense how staying becomes its own kind of decision, one shaped more by acceptance than by any need to resist what is quietly unfolding. Children grow within this shifting environment, and for them, these changes are not changes at all, but simply the way things are, and you notice how naturally they move between traditions, never pausing to ask where one ends and another begins. This quiet adaptation feels almost effortless, as though the next generation carries both the old and the new forward without needing to separate them, which feels a bit like using technology without ever thinking about how it was once considered new or unfamiliar. Historically, cultural shifts often unfold more slowly than political ones, and you begin to understand that while systems of power may change within a generation, the deeper patterns of belief and behavior take much longer to transform, settling gently over time rather than shifting all at once. You begin to sense that culture, in its quiet persistence, holds gently on to the elements that matter most, allowing them to endure even as external structures continue to evolve. And this quiet resilience feels steady and calm, like a melody that continues beneath changing harmonies without ever fading or losing its presence within the rhythm of everyday life. Daily, life remains grounded in the same essential rhythms: planting, harvesting, gathering, and resting, and these familiar patterns provide a sense of continuity that softens the presence of broader changes, making them feel less disruptive, almost as if they exist gently in the background, never asking for attention, yet quietly shaping everything around them. And as you observe more closely, you begin to understand how this quiet consistency offers comfort, allowing people to move forward without feeling unsettled, like following a familiar path even as the scenery slowly changes, where the direction remains steady and the experience feels calm, continuous, and gently connected to everything that came before. You begin to notice how people interpret new rituals in their own ways, gently blending meanings instead of replacing them. And this quiet reinterpretation allows individuals to hold on to a sense of familiarity, even as their world continues to shift around them, like adjusting a well-loved recipe without ever removing the ingredients that make it feel like home. Over time, what once felt new begins to settle into something ordinary, and what once seemed unfamiliar gradually becomes expected, and this slow normalization feels gentle and unforced, like easing into a slightly different routine, without ever deciding when the change truly began or noticing the exact moment it became part of everyday life. The land itself remains unchanged, the rivers continuing to guide life with their steady and patient flow, and this consistency quietly anchors everything else, offering a sense of stability that allows people to adapt without losing their connection to place, like holding on to something constant while everything else shifts softly around it. You begin to sense how this stability softens the presence of change, allowing new ideas and practices to settle naturally without causing disruption, like adding something new to a familiar space without needing to rearrange everything else. And this quiet balance makes transformation feel less like a challenge and more like a gentle continuation. As you stand within this evolving yet familiar world, you sense that these subtle changes are gradually settling into a new kind of balance, one that feels neither entirely old nor entirely new, but something comfortably in between, like a moment that belongs to both the past and the present without needing to choose between them. The rhythm of life continues without interruption, and you find yourself adjusting alongside it without effort or resistance, as though the world itself is guiding you gently into its new shape, without ever needing to explain what has changed. Like following a path that feels natural, even if you cannot remember where it first began. And slowly, without urgency or resistance, everything begins to feel steady once more, as if these quiet transformations have found their place within the ongoing flow of time, allowing life to continue just as calmly as it always has, where nothing feels rushed and nothing feels out of place anymore. You begin to sense that the quiet balance settling over the land is not accidental, but carefully shaped, as if an unseen structure now supports the rhythm of daily life, guiding it gently without interrupting its natural flow, much like a well-organized schedule that somehow works without needing constant reminders, quietly holding everything together without ever asking to be noticed directly. At the center of this emerging order, systems begin to take form, subtle at first, yet gradually more visible, and you notice how certain individuals now carry responsibilities that extend beyond ritual, overseeing resources, movement, and coordination across wider distances, like people who somehow keep everything running smoothly without needing to explain how they manage to do it so consistently. The gathering of goods becomes more organized over time, and what was once shared informally now follows a quiet and predictable pattern where portions of each harvest are collected and redistributed, not as a burden, but as part of a shared understanding. Though it does feel slightly like contributing to something without ever fully reading the terms and conditions. You observe how these collections, which resemble early forms of taxation, are handled with care and attention, recorded and remembered, to ensure that resources move where they are needed most. And this quiet system creates a sense of reliability that supports the growing structure, like knowing something will arrive exactly when it is expected, without needing to check repeatedly. To manage this increasing complexity, marks begin to appear, simple impressions pressed into soft clay, forming symbols that represent goods, quantities, and agreements. And you sense how these early records transform memory into something more stable, allowing information to exist beyond the limits of individual recollection and quietly extending the reach of understanding across time. Historically, this development becomes known as cuneiform writing, one of the earliest forms of recorded language, emerging in ancient Mesopotamia to track resources and transactions. And you realize that these small, deliberate marks carry the weight of entire systems within them, quietly shaping how information is preserved and shared across generations. You watch as scribes carefully press reed styluses into clay tablets, their movements steady, deliberate, and precise. And there is something calming about this process, like watching someone write a list they truly intend to follow, which feels both reassuring and slightly surprising, especially when compared to how easily such intentions are often forgotten in more modern settings. These records allow information to travel beyond immediate memory, creating continuity across both time and space, and you begin to understand how this quiet innovation strengthens the structure of power, making it more stable and less dependent on individual recollection, like building something that continues to function even when no one is actively thinking about it. Rituals, too, begin to take on new significance within this evolving system, becoming not only moments of spiritual connection, but also tools that reinforce authority and unity, guiding how people relate to the broader structure that now surrounds them, like shared practices that quietly remind everyone of their place within a larger and carefully balanced whole. Ceremonies marking leadership, such as coronations, begin to emerge with greater clarity and structure, where individuals are formally recognized within the system. And these events carry a sense of order that feels both symbolic and practical, like confirming something that has already been quietly understood long before the moment itself arrives. Offerings and sacrifices, once purely expressions of belief and devotion, now also serve to demonstrate alignment with the larger structure. And you notice how these acts subtly connect spiritual practice with social organization, blending meaning with function in ways that feel natural. Even if the connection itself is not always consciously acknowledged by those who participate, the presence of these structured rituals creates shared experiences that extend across multiple communities, reinforcing a sense of belonging within a larger whole, and this collective identity begins to feel as natural as the cycles that first shaped life here, like something that has always existed, even though it has only recently taken on a more defined form. You begin to see how power, once diffuse and subtle, now becomes more clearly defined, not in a way that disrupts daily life, but in a way that organizes it, providing clarity where there was once only quiet understanding, like turning something intuitive into something that can be shared, repeated, and relied upon across many different situations. And yet, despite this growing structure, the rhythm of the land remains steady and unchanged. The rivers continue their patient and reliable flow, and the fields still respond to care and attention, grounding everything within the same natural cycles that have always guided life here, like a constant presence that quietly supports all other changes without needing to adapt. This balance between structure and rhythm creates a sense of stability that feels both new and familiar at the same time, as though the world has quietly learned how to organize itself without losing its original calm, like adding order to something that was already working, without ever disrupting the gentle flow that made it possible. You notice how people move within the system with ease, adapting to its patterns without resistance or hesitation, and this quiet acceptance allows the structure to settle more deeply, becoming part of the natural order rather than something imposed upon it, like a habit that forms so naturally it never feels like a change at all. As this new order continues to take shape, clear and steady, you begin to sense that while much has changed beneath the surface, traces of what came before remain present, quietly woven into every gesture and every routine, like echoes that never fully disappear, even as new sounds begin to take their place. You begin to notice how the echoes of earlier rhythms continue to shape behavior in quiet and almost invisible ways, guiding how people respond to new structures without ever needing to think about it directly, like instincts that remain even as everything else slowly shifts, offering a sense of continuity that feels steady, familiar, and gently reassuring within ongoing and gradual transformation. And even as this order settles into place with calm certainty, you begin to sense that beneath its structured surface, those earlier rhythms still linger quietly, not as something lost, but as something remembered, waiting gently beneath everything that has come to replace and redefine them. You stand once more beside the quiet rivers, and although the land feels familiar, you begin to notice that its shape, not the soil or water, but the way it is understood, has gently shifted, as if invisible lines have been drawn across it, like rearranging sections in a library without ever needing to move the books themselves from their original places. These new boundaries are not marked by walls or barriers, but by a shared recognition that settles quietly among the people, where they begin to understand that they belong to something wider. And this awareness feels subtle and natural, like realizing you are part of a larger group without ever being formally introduced to it in any direct or structured way. The idea of territory becomes more defined, not through conflict or sudden division, but through quiet agreement and emerging structure. And you sense how these invisible lines begin to guide movement and responsibility, even though the land itself continues to appear open, unchanged, and as welcoming as it has always been beneath the steady and patient movement of time. At the same time, the flow of goods expands beyond local exchange, and what was once a self-contained system of survival begins to connect to wider networks, allowing resources to travel farther than before. And this gradual expansion feels a bit like discovering online shopping after years of visiting only familiar markets within walking distance. Grain now moves along the rivers toward distant settlements. Tools crafted in one region begin to appear in another, and materials once considered rare slowly become more accessible, creating a quiet sense of abundance that did not exist before. Like finding something you once searched for suddenly available without effort or explanation. You notice how this broader exchange begins to influence daily life, not by replacing what already exists, but by gently adding new possibilities and variations. And this diversity feels both enriching and slightly complex. Like having many choices for dinner and still finding comfort in returning to something simple and familiar at the end. That cultural practices continue to evolve within this expanding system, and you observe how older rituals remain present, carefully woven into newer ones, creating layers of meaning that do not compete, but coexist. Like threads of different colors forming a single pattern that feels both familiar and newly shaped at the same time. A familiar ceremony may now include gestures introduced from distant communities, and while these additions feel new and slightly different, they do not replace the original form, but instead gently expand it. Like adding new verses to a song that still carries the same calm melody beneath each variation that slowly and quietly unfolds over time, without ever losing its sense of continuity. Historically, many traditions that exist today emerge from this kind of blending, where influences from different cultures combine gradually across generations, and you begin to understand that what feels ancient and unchanging is often the result of long and quiet adaptation, shaped more by steady continuity than by any single moment of sudden or clearly defined transformation over extended periods of time. You begin to notice small details that carry the memory of earlier times. A gesture performed just slightly differently, a symbol appearing across different spaces, or a phrase holding meaning no one fully explains, yet everyone seems to understand without effort. Like remembering something familiar without being able to recall exactly when or how that understanding first quietly took shape within your awareness over time. These subtle traces remain gently embedded within daily life, not as deliberate reminders, but as natural continuations of what came before, and their presence feels quietly comforting, like recognizing a familiar scent in a place that has otherwise changed, offering a soft reassurance that something constant and steady still exists beneath the surface of everything else that continues to shift around it. Even as systems grow more structured and connected, these small elements resist complete transformation, preserving a sense of continuity that anchors people within their evolving world. And this quiet persistence feels steady and dependable, like a rhythm that continues softly in the background, without ever needing to be noticed directly. You observe how individuals respond to these changes in different ways, some embracing the new layers with quiet curiosity, while others hold more closely to familiar forms, and this variation feels natural and unforced, like choosing between something new and something known, without ever feeling that one choice must replace the other entirely. The landscape itself remains steady. The rivers continue to guide movement and life with their patient flow, and this constancy provides a foundation that allows everything else to shift gently without losing balance, like standing on firm ground while watching the world slowly rearrange itself in quiet and thoughtful ways over time. What was once considered new becomes integrated into daily life, and what was once separate begins to feel like part of a shared identity. And this merging unfolds so gradually that it often goes unnoticed unless you pause long enough to reflect on how different things once were. You begin to sense that this process of blending is never truly complete, that it continues quietly across generations, shaping each moment without drawing attention to itself. And this ongoing transformation feels less like change and more like a gentle continuation of something that has always been in motion. As you stand within this layered world, where past and present exist together without conflict, you begin to understand that change does not erase what came before, but reshapes it into forms that continue to live on, like echoes that soften but never fully disappear within the steady passage of time. The rhythm of life continues without interruption, and even as new patterns gently settle into place, the older ones remain quietly present beneath them, creating a sense of depth that feels both grounding and expansive, like listening to a familiar melody that now reveals soft variations you had never fully noticed before, yet somehow always felt. But even in this quiet continuity, where everything feels balanced and gently connected, you begin to sense that nothing ever truly stands still, and that beneath the calm surface of this evolving world, the slow and patient movement of change continues, shaping everything in ways that are felt long before they are ever fully understood. You remain within the quiet order that once felt so stable, and at first nothing appears to change. As the rivers continue their steady movement, and the fields still offer their quiet abundance, yet beneath this calm surface, a different kind of motion begins to unfold, one that feels less visible, but no less present within the slow and patient passage of time. The structure that once brought clarity now stretches across wider distances, and you begin to sense how maintaining these extended connections requires more effort, more coordination, and more careful attention, which feels a bit like trying to manage too many open tabs at once, each one still important, yet harder to keep track of as they quietly accumulate. Resources that once seemed abundant begin to feel slightly strained, not in a sudden or dramatic way, but enough to be gently noticed. And you observe how the balance between what is given and what is needed becomes more delicate, like a system that still functions, but now requires more thoughtful and careful handling to remain steady. Beyond the edges of this expanding system, other groups continue to exist, and their presence introduces subtle pressures, not always through direct conflict, but through quiet competition for space, resources, and influence. And this steady tension feels continuous rather than abrupt, like a background hum that never fully fades. You notice how the flow of goods becomes more complex, traveling across longer distances and passing through more points of exchange. And while this network remains functional, it begins to require greater oversight, which gradually changes how people experience their place within it, making everything feel slightly more distant and less immediate than before. The rituals that once felt deeply personal and closely tied to the natural world begin to shift in tone, becoming more formal, more repeated, and perhaps slightly distant, as though their meaning is remembered more than it is directly felt. Like reciting something familiar without pausing to reflect on why it once mattered so deeply. You sense that. These practices continue because they are expected, not always because they are fully understood. And this quiet continuation feels a little like following traditions whose origins have softened over time, yet are still carried forward out of respect, habit, and a shared sense that they still hold some form of quiet importance. Some individuals begin to question these rituals, not openly or with urgency, but in small and private ways, wondering whether the gestures still carry the same meaning they once did. And these thoughts remain gentle and unspoken, like brief whispers that pass through the mind and fade without ever needing to be shared aloud. Historically, this gradual strain can be seen in early empires such as the Akkadian Empire, which expanded across vast regions under rulers like Sargon and those who followed him, creating one of the earliest large-scale political systems that connected multiple cities and cultures. Over time, however, maintaining this wide structure became increasingly difficult. As communication slowed, resources were stretched thin, and distant territories required constant attention, gradually placing pressure on the system in ways that were not sudden, but quietly accumulated across years of continued expansion and responsibility. Archaeological records and inscriptions suggest that later Akkadian rulers encountered growing instability, not always through direct invasion, but through internal pressures, shifting alliances, and environmental challenges such as drought, which quietly disrupted agricultural systems, showing how even strong structures can weaken when stretched beyond the balance that once supported them. You begin to understand that power, when extended across great distances, becomes less immediate and less connected to daily life. And this growing distance creates space for uncertainty to settle in, even if it is never fully expressed, like a message that takes longer to arrive, and gradually feels less certain the further it must travel. The leaders, who once guided with clarity, now operate within a system that feels larger than any single individual, and their decisions, though still important, are shaped by considerations that extend far beyond the local community, making their influence feel both present and distant at the same time. You observe how people continue their daily routines, planting, gathering, and resting much as they always have. And on the surface, everything appears familiar and unchanged. Yet beneath that steady rhythm, a quiet awareness begins to take root, suggesting that things are no longer quite as simple or as stable as they once seemed. Even if no one speaks of it directly, this awareness does not lead to sudden or dramatic change, but instead brings a gradual shift in perspective, where individuals begin to rely more on what is close, immediate, and tangible, finding a sense of stability in their surroundings rather than in distant systems that feel increasingly complex, harder to follow, and less certain in their quiet and unfolding influence. The rivers continue their steady and patient flow, unchanged by these subtle developments, and their quiet constancy becomes even more noticeable, offering a gentle reminder that not everything is shaped by the same pressures, and that some rhythms remain calm and reliable, even as others begin to loosen, shift, and slowly move beyond the balance they once held. You begin to see how systems, no matter how carefully built, eventually encounter limits, not because they fail all at once, but because they stretch beyond the balance that once sustained them. And this realization feels calm rather than alarming, like noticing something slowly adjusting rather than suddenly breaking apart. As this quiet unraveling continues, not through disruption, but through gradual release. You sense that the world is gently shifting once more, allowing space for new patterns to form while older ones soften, creating a transition that feels natural and unforced within the steady passage of time. There is no clear moment that marks this change, no single event that defines it, only a gradual easing of structure and a quiet return to simpler rhythms, as though the system itself is slowly exhaling after holding its shape for a long and careful stretch out without urgency or resistance. Everything begins to drift once more into the steady, timeless flow of the rivers, where change continues quietly beneath the surface, and the rhythm of the world carries on, calm and unbroken, as though it has always known how to begin again, gently returning to itself through the slow and patient movement of time. You find yourself once more beside the quiet rivers, where everything feels both familiar and distant, as though you have traveled far without ever truly leaving this place. And you begin to sense that the story you have followed has not ended, but only circled back to its beginning, like a thought returning gently to where it first took shape in silence. The land remains steady and patient, shaped by water and time, and you recall how it once existed in a simple balance before structures formed and meanings expanded. And there is a quiet recognition that everything you have witnessed has unfolded within this same unchanging space, as if the surface of the world has always held these shifting layers beneath it. You remember the early rhythms, the soft repetition of planting and gathering, and the quiet rituals that connected people to something unseen, and how these simple patterns formed the foundation of everything that followed, like the opening notes of a melody that continues to echo softly beneath every change that arrives later, without ever fully replacing what came before. Then came the shaping of power, subtle at first, emerging through guidance and shared belief. And you recall how it grew not through force alone, but through understanding and repetition, gradually organizing life into something more structured, more connected, like water finding channels that slowly define its path without ever breaking its natural flow. That structure expanded beyond the immediate land, reaching into distant regions and bringing new ideas, systems, and relationships. And you sense how this growth once felt natural and even necessary, like a path continuing forward simply because it was already there, without anyone stopping long enough to question where its gentle momentum might eventually lead. For a while, everything settled into a new kind of balance, where order and rhythm existed together, supporting one another in a way that felt complete. And this stability seemed almost permanent, as though the system had discovered a way to sustain itself indefinitely, resting in a calm confidence that nothing would ever need to change again. And yet, slowly and quietly, that balance began to shift once more. Not through sudden disruption or visible collapse, but through the gradual accumulation of pressures that built without urgency, until the structure that once felt solid began to loosen, at its edges returning gently toward something simpler, less defined, and more fluid in its unfolding. You begin to understand that this pattern, land, power, change, stability, and release, is not unique to this place or time, but part of a larger rhythm that continues across generations, repeating in forms that feel both familiar and new, like variations of a single story told again and again through different voices. Nothing here is truly permanent. Not systems, not structures, not even the meanings attached to rituals. And this realization does not feel unsettling, but instead calm and grounding, like accepting the change is not an interruption of life, but simply another way that life continues to express itself through time. Rituals themselves begin to feel different now, less like fixed actions and more like gentle attempts to understand the passing of time. Small gestures that give shape to something that cannot be held or paused. Like trying to trace the movement of water with your hands and realizing it was never meant to stay still. You notice how each generation adds its own layer to these rituals, adjusting them, reshaping them, and carrying them forward in ways that reflect their own understanding. And this quiet evolution continues without announcement or interruption, like a river changing course so slowly that no single moment can be named as the turning point. The rivers, unchanged by all of this, continue to move steadily, their surface, reflecting light and shadow without interruption. And you sense how they hold the memory of everything that has passed without needing to preserve it consciously, as though remembering and forgetting are the same thing in their endless and effortless flow. The wind moves softly across the fields, carrying the same quiet presence it has always carried, and the grasses respond with gentle motion, as though the land itself breathes in a rhythm that exists independently of human understanding, steady and patient, like a presence that was never meant to be noticed but always felt. You imagine the generations that have come and gone here, each one living within its own version of the world, each one believing in the systems and meanings of its time, and then slowly passing them forward, altered but enduring, like footprints that remain visible even after the traveler has long disappeared. And as you sit within this calm awareness, you begin to feel the edges of the story soften, the details becoming less defined, the movement of time slowing down until it feels almost suspended, like a quiet lull settling gently over everything without asking for attention or expecting anything in return. Now the rivers continue to flow, the wind continues to move, and somewhere within that endless motion, you sense that the same patterns are forming again, quietly, patiently, without urgency or intention, as if the world is always returning to the same gentle arrangement, no matter how far it seems to travel. There is no final ending here, only continuation, and you begin to understand that what feels like completion is simply another churning of the same deep rhythm, where beginnings and endings are not separate, but woven together within the same flowing current of time itself. And in this quiet recognition, where everything dissolves into balance and motion, you feel the story release its final shape, not as something concluded, but as something gently returning to silence, where it can begin again without ever needing to be spoken. The rivers continue their steady passage through the land, carrying light, shadow, memory, and absence in equal measure, and you realize that nothing has ever truly left, only changed. Its form within the same unbroken movement that has always been here, and always will be. And somewhere, in the quiet rhythm of the earth, where water meets time and silence holds everything together without effort, you understand that the story never ends at all. It only flows onward, endlessly, softly, as though it has always been beginning again. The script comes to a close. Thank you all for listening.